when a gun is used in a crime in Chicago, where'd that gun come from? And now you know, all right, here's somebody who seems to be willing to sell a gun to a 15-year-old who had a known record.
But you're only going to be asking people to get a license and do background checks if they give out business cards, if they're selling weapons that are in the original packaging. Somebody just walking around a gun show selling a weapon, not necessarily going to have to register.
No, look, there's going to be a case-by-case evaluation. Are they on an ongoing basis making a profit, and are they repeatedly selling firearms?
I want you to meet Sheriff Paul Babiou of Pinal County, Arizona. He's a Republican running for Congress after the recent terror attacks. Sheriff, I know you've been telling citizens to arm themselves to protect their families. What's your question to the President?
Well, first, deputies' slow response time has been mentioned a couple of times. I want to be clear that my deputies have a very fast emergency response.
I'm sure that's true.
Yes. Mr. President, you've said you've been thwarted by, frustrated by Congress. As a sheriff, I oftentimes get frustrated, but I don't make the laws. And I've sworn an oath to enforce the law, to uphold the Constitution, same oath you've taken. Mm-hmm. And the talk and why we're here is all these mass shootings. And yet you've said in your executive action, it wouldn't have solved even one of these or the terrorist attack.
No, I didn't say that.
Well,
I didn't say that it wouldn't solve one.
Looking at the information, what would it have solved? Now, knowing
none of the recent mass shootings, I should point out, none of the guns were purchased from an unlicensed dealer.
Correct. And that's what I'm speaking to, the executive action that you mentioned earlier, aspirin, toys, or cars. And they're not written about in the Constitution. I want to know, and I think all of us really want to get to the solution, and you said don't talk past each other. What would you have done to prevent these mass shootings and the terrorist attack? And how do we get those with mental illness and criminals? That's the real problem here. How are we going to get them to follow the laws?
Well, first of all, appreciate your service. Good luck on your race. You sure you want to go to Congress?
I don't want to endorse it.
I'm sure that's true. That'll hurt you. Yeah, and I'm sure it's a Republican district. Look, crime is always going to be with us. So I think it's really important for us not to suggest that if we can't solve every crime, we shouldn't try to solve any crimes. And the problem when we talk about that guns don't kill people, people kill people, or it's primarily a mental health problem, or it's a criminal and evil problem, and that's what we have to get at. All of us are interested in fighting crime. I'm very proud of the fact that violent crime rates have continued to go down during the course of my presidency. I've got an attorney general and FBI that works very closely with local law enforcement in busting up crime rings all the time. That's a huge priority to us. And we're probably providing grants to your department to help go after criminals. The challenge we have is that in many instances, you don't know ahead of time who's going to be the criminal. It's not as if criminals walk around with a label saying, I'm a criminal. And by the way, the young man who killed those kids in Newtown, he didn't have a criminal record, and so we didn't know ahead of time necessarily that he was going to do something like that. But he was able to have access to an arsenal that allowed him in very short order to kill an entire classroom of small children. And so the question then becomes, are there ways for us, since we can't identify that person all the time, are there ways for us to make it less lethal when something like that happens? And I mentioned this during my speech at the White House a couple of days ago. Right around the time of Newtown in China, a guy who was obviously similarly deranged had a knife and started attacking a bunch of school children. About the same number were cut or stabbed by this guy. But most of them survived. And the reason was because he wasn't yielding a semi-automatic. So the main point I think that I want to make here is that everybody here is in favor of going after criminals, locking them up, making sure that we're creating an environment where kids don't turn into criminals, and providing the support that they need. Those are all important things. Nobody's saying we need to be going soft on criminals. What we do have to make sure of is that we don't make it so easy for them to have access to deadly weapons. In neighborhoods like Chicago, but I keep on using Chicago, this is all across the country. You go into any neighborhood. It used to be that parents would see some kids messing around on the corner, and they'd say, yo, even if they weren't the parent of those children, go back inside, stop doing that. And over time, it was a lot harder to discipline somebody else's kid and have the community maintain order or talk to police officers if somebody's doing something wrong, because now somebody is worried about getting shot. And if we can create an environment that's just a little bit safer for in those communities, that will help. And if it doesn't infringe on your Second Amendment rights, and it doesn't infringe on your Second Amendment rights, and you're still able to get a firearm for your protection, why wouldn't we want to do that?
We got to take a break. We're going to take a quick break. Our live town hall conversation, Guns in America with President Barack Obama, continues right after this. And welcome back. We're live at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, continuing our 360 Town Hall conversation with President Barack Obama. Guns in America, talking to voices from all sides of the issue, including the president. You made your announcement just the other day in a very obviously emotional ceremony at the White House. And I want to play just a moment from it for those who haven't seen it.
And from first graders in Newtown. First graders. And from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. Every time I think about those kids, it gets me mad.
I think a lot of people were surprised by that moment.
I was too, actually. You know, I visited Newtown 2 days after what happened, so it was still very raw. It's the only time I've ever seen Secret Service cry on duty. And it wasn't just the parents. You had siblings, you know, 10-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 3-year-olds, who in some cases didn't even understand that their brother or sister weren't going to be coming home. And I've said this before, it continues to haunt me. It was one of the worst days of my presidency. But look, I want to emphasize that there are a lot of tragedies that happen out there as a consequence of the victims of crime. You know, there are police officers who are out there laying down their lives to protect us every single day. You know, and tears are appropriate for them as well, and I visit with those families as well, victims of terrorism, soldiers coming home. You know, there's a lot of heartache out there, and I don't suggest that this is the only kind of heartache we should be working on. You know, I spend a lot of time and a lot of hours In fact, a lot more hours than I spend on this trying to prevent terrorist attacks. I spend a lot of time and a lot of hours trying to make sure that we're continuing to reduce our crime rate. There are a whole bunch of other answers that are just as important when it comes to making sure that the streets of places like Chicago and Baltimore are safer. Making sure kids get a good early childhood education. Making sure that we're teaching conflict resolution that doesn't involve violence. Making sure that faith communities are able to reach out to young people and intervene in timely ways. So this is not a recipe for solving every problem. Again, I just want to emphasize that the goal here is just to make progress. And it's interesting, as I enter into my last year as president, I could not be prouder of the work that we've done, but it also makes you really humble, because you realize that change takes a long time, and a lot of the work you do is just to incrementally make things better so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the crime rate has gone down. That's not just because of my administration. The groundwork was laid by a bunch of good work by law enforcement and others for years across administrations on a bipartisan basis. The same is true with traffic safety. The same is true with advances in medicine. The same can be true with this if we stop exaggerating or mischaracterizing the positions of either side, and we just come up with some sensible areas that people agree with. Background checks are an example. The majority of gun owners agree with this.
You talk about faith communities. Father Michael Pfleger is here. I know you know him well. He's a Roman Catholic priest in Chicago. For those who don't know, his church is St. Sabina on the south side of Chicago. I was there about a month ago. It was a great honor to be there. Father, you've given a lot of eulogies for a lot of kids in your community, far too many over the 40 years that you have been there. What's your question for the president?
Mr. President, first of all, thank you. Thank you for your courage and your passion, and keep pushing. I happen to be from one of those cities where violence is not going down. Not only, as Anderson mentioned, the 55 shot, there's been 11 killed in 7 days in Chicago. One of the main reasons for that is the easy access to guns. It's easier to get a gun in my neighborhood than it is a computer. And the reality is because many of those guns have been bought legally. And I understand why people are pushing against you, because they understand it's a business, and it's about a business. And so if we cut back the easy access to guns, less money for the gun manufacturers, less money for the gun lobby, I understand the business of it, but that business is causing blood. And the kids that are dying in Chicago, and for many years, nobody even cared about Chicago because the violence is primarily black and brown. The reality is that I don't understand why we can't title guns just like cars. If I have a car and I give it to you, Mr. President, and I don't transfer a title and you're in an accident, it's on me. We don't take cars away by putting titles on them. Why can't we do that with guns? And every gun in America. So if somebody who's buying 200 guns, selling them on the streets, if they can't transfer those titles, then they're going to be held responsible for the guns that they sell.
Well, Father Mike, first of all, for those of you who don't know him, has been working since before I moved to Chicago, and I was a 23-year-old when I first met him. And somehow I aged and he didn't. Which,
Your gray hair is not going back. I can tell you from experience.
he was always the best-looking priest in Chicago. So, but Father Pfleger's done heroic work at St. Sabina Parish. Issues like licensing, registration, that's an area where there's just not enough national consensus at this stage to even consider it. And part of it is people's concern that that becomes a prelude to taking people's guns away. I mean, part of the challenge in this is that the gun debate gets wrapped up in broader debates about whether the federal government is oppressive and there are conspiracy theories floating around the internet these days all the time. We did a military exercise in Texas, and a whole bunch of folks